Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Glenn Diesen, who is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and also editor at Russia and Global Affairs. His research focus is on the political economy of Greater Eurasia. We'll be discussing his new book, Great Power Politics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And how is life in Norway, Dr. Diesen?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Norway is good. Well, summertime is better than winter, obviously. Actually, I only recently came back to Norway. I was working abroad for the past 20 years. So, it's good to be back home.
Okay, that's good. Me too. I was abroad and I'm back home now. I've been following your op-eds in different places on Russia Today, for example, for some time, and I learned of your new book, and I think that you hit one of the most important themes in the world today. Those two themes of the great powers and the conflicts now that are being generated between the great powers, Russia, China, US, and the Great Reset, as I call it, or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We're at a crossroads, as we were, I think, a century ago. We face, in one sense, economic oblivion, the bursting of the global debt bubble. There is the potential for great military conflict between the great powers yet again. There's the opportunity for some states or blocs to rise in status and for others to fall way behind. The technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution will determine many of these factors, as well as whether, mankind will live in a freer world or one that is more authoritarian and dystopian. At the beginning of your book, you cite former Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov, quote, "History has taught us that humanity's transition from one world order to another has always been driven by the accumulation of new production technologies, with wars and revolutions usually acting as a catalyst," end quote. So you give an interesting, useful history at the start of your book, looking back at the previous industrial revolutions and how Britain harnessed the first industrial revolution to cement itself as the global empire. Germany, France, and the US followed. China, Russia fell behind. So now we're in this fourth industrial revolution. Russia, China, US, EU have the opportunity, I guess, to upend the chessboard. But it seems that the countries that are working with AI the most and with the big data are well ahead of the pack, such as China and the US. So, do you see us at this great historic crossroads and moment of tectonic shift? Do you see, is this a moment for great opportunity as well as catastrophic danger?
It goes on this scale between great opportunities, but also the possibility for great destruction and a lot of challenges. Now, as you correctly pointed out, I guess the technology is often not appreciated enough in terms of its impact on great power politics, because it really has a very transformative power in terms of changing not just societies within, but also the relationship between states. That is how they compete and also the distribution of power. As you point out, the previous industrial revolutions very much changed the world as it was. Obviously, China and Russia fell behind, and they paid a very big price. So both of them were defeated by the British in the mid-19th century. So obviously, the Chinese with the Opium Wars, which was largely because they've fallen behind on the Industrial Revolution, and the Russians in the Crimean War in the 1850s. So they both suffered greatly for this, while those who managed properly the industrial revolutions, they rose to power. So this is seen as an opportunity to redeal the card, if you want, by many states. Now, obviously, you're right. The main two powers to look at is obviously China and the United States as the main incumbent and the challenger. But you also have other countries, including Russia, who has it seems. It can play a big role. It can make a great leap forward, or it can fall behind again. It's not really determined yet how it's going to be able to play its cards.
And after you're reading your book, I was thinking maybe I will have to change the name of this podcast from Geopolitics and Empire to Geoeconomics and Empire, because you write quote, the concept of technological sovereignty recognizes that industrial capacity and state sovereignty are closely linked. Dominant states that fail to extend and cement their technological leadership can descend into irrelevance as the technologies that underpin their primacy become outdated, end quote. You were just kind of touching on that. But then you write, quote, geoeconomics is used here as the point of departure and the main variable to explore great power or rivalry. Great power politics after the Cold War has shifted from geopolitics to geoeconomics as power derives increasingly from the control over international markets rather than merely military hardware and territory, end quote. So, I think your point on geoeconomics surpassing geopolitics perhaps in importance is a good one. Can you tell us more about, the rise and importance of geoeconomics?
Yeah, so most of my focus is on the economic aspect. Again, there's a lot of literature out there on how this is impacting military technology, which shouldn't be understated either. However, I look mostly at the economic aspects. Well, in geoeconomics, we look towards how economic power translates into political power, and effectively states, they tend to intervene in the marketplace to establish asymmetrical interdependence. So the less dependent side in any relationship is able to extract certain political power from the other. So from this perspective, technology, being technological leaders is quite important. And it's always been this way. This is why great powers, in order to be great powers, they really need to have what's then referred to as technological sovereignty, that is a certain control over the main technologies there are. So this was, again, in the 19th century, it meant something different. At that point, nation building was very closely linked to industrial power. This was also experienced for the United States. The main reason they began to emulate the European manufacturing societies was exactly because they wanted to break away from this excessive reliance on British industries. This was then also emulated by other countries such as Germany, France, Russia, and the objective was then develop their own manufacturing based on industries in order to gain economic independence from Britain, because without it, they wouldn't have political independence. Now, this is the same today, obviously, but now in the fourth industrial revolution. So it's very different technologies. You have these new digital platforms capable of manipulating the physical world. And within this format, we see, again, not just manufacturing power, but countries seeking to have technological sovereignty over various digital platforms. So it does have an enduring relevance, this geoeconomics. I can just maybe add that I think for many, they kind of believe that the world had shifted towards liberal economics, all free trade, no state intervention. But typically, we only have liberal economic systems only form when there's a strong concentration of economic power under hegemon. So we had Britain in the 19th century, and then the US from the mid-20th century. Now, under such power distribution, it is the interest of economic hegemon to liberalize trade, to cement its competitive position. Now, I think through the Cold War, we kind of had this belief, well, many had, that through liberalism, we had transcended essentially geoeconomics or neo-mercantilism, but it's a very, very unique time. I mean, the main adversaries of the United States were all communist states, so they were very much decoupled from international markets. Meanwhile, all of America's allies were very much dependent on the United States for security. So this had a strong impact in terms of mitigating geoeconomic rivalry between them. So, but now we've seen more or less all this broken down. Now all the major powers are very much speaking quite openly about the need for geoeconomic power. Just one last example with the European Union. Again, their whole ideology for so long was, to be this liberal project, post-sovereign, free market, and now they effectively turn completely around and recognize, no, in order to survive in the new world, we need, using other words than technological sovereignty, but referring to strategic autonomy, developing European sovereignty. So very much the same language as Russia and China, arguing that in order for a great power to be great, it needs to control its own technologies and its own economic power. So it is, I guess the Cold War will be seen as a great exception under very unique circumstances.
Yeah, and maybe to delve into that a bit deeper, in your book you talk about the splinter net, the nationalization of the internet, or the breakup or territorialization of the internet. We know that the U.S. big tech works with the Pentagon. I mean, indeed, the Pentagon seed funded a lot of U.S. big tech, such as Facebook and Google. And they work together against foreign nations, oftentimes in regime change operations. You've cited how Facebook, works with NATO. In your book, you talk about how they work with the National Endowment for Democracy. They police their platforms for dissent. My own American government and American big tech has, deplatformed me from Patreon, and I even got a mention in the Associated Press by the Atlantic Council. So, but then on the other hand, for example, Russia isn't much better. I was living in Kazakhstan, which has often similar policies as Russia, and my personal email service was blocked both in Russia and Kazakhstan, and I had to go through 3 VPNs before I found one that worked. And then, so you're talking about this, like each country, each region now is developing its own in-house technologies, and I guess one reason for that, if they don't, then they will be dominated by foreign big tech, as well as the countries from which this foreign big tech comes from, which is, I guess, a big threat, to themselves, and as well as many countries who don't develop these systems, they will fall way behind. So could you kind of speak more on these issues?
Well, what you're referring to now is the aspect of the technologies for communication, and obviously this, one should be careful not to divide into good and bad countries or great powers, because they're all kind of dealing with the same issues. Now, for all countries, when it comes to disseminating information, you more or less have to think about 3 poles. On one hand, you have the government who would like to control somewhat the narrative and disseminating information, and then you also have the public. Now, usually in a stable society, you find some kind of a balance between the state and the public, but then also you have a third party, which are foreign governments. So you have this a strange competition. Now, obviously, the effort to nationalize the digital space, or a splinter net, or balkanizing the internet, is to make it easier to cut off one country from the wider internet. Now, China and Russia obviously been working towards this end, and it's seen as a way to insulate themselves a little bit from the United States. But you also see the U.S. doing the same to some extent. They no longer want to use Chinese technologies. They don't want Russia's Kaspersky anymore. So they're all blocking each other's technological platforms and insisting that in order to have proper security, domestically they should rely only on, or primarily at least, on domestic platforms, and also, again, with Russia and China, have the ability to cut themselves off from the wider internet and solely rely on a domestic internet. So, taking control over the domestic space. Now, obviously, the main problem you have is many governments will do this quite reasonably to protect themselves from hostile foreign powers. But in that process, they also changed the power between state and people. So we see this also in the United States, but you're very correct. You also see the same in Russia and Kazakhstan and China as well. If they say, we have to protect from foreign governments, that additional power the government grants itself is also used against its own people. And again, it's not just Russian news services who are being labeled foreign agents and all in the United States. They're also now censoring their own people, because once the government had this instrument of power to censor, as the tech giants have, the problem is if they also become involved in very polarized domestic politics. And I guess in the United States, we see that to some extent, the tech giants aligning themselves more with the Democrats and, fighting what they call, for example, Russian influence, which is then linked to conservatives. And it's a very messy ordeal, because we don't really have any new ways of addressing these new technologies. So again, I have one chapter in the book where I compare again the internet to the printing press, because we've gone through this before, and so based on that history, one could expect some chaotic years ahead.
Yeah, I've told this story before. When I was in Kazakhstan, I came into direct contact with the youth that I was working with, who were working with unwittingly the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and Open Society, the whole regime change apparatus in Kazakhstan. I even warned the Kazakh government. And so, as you say, like, they need to put protections into place to protect themselves. But at the same time, it's like, which me as a foreigner, like, okay, I agree. You do need to protect yourself, but okay, can I use my email? Can I use VPN? I mean, you guys are going a little bit too far. Come on. I mean, how can you need email to do everything? So another theme of your book, you talk about industrial revolutions, how they redistribute and reorganize power, and it seems what we've seen so far, our current transition is, in a sense, doing away with democracy. And you mentioned, big tech is now getting all this power, big finance, big tech, and it's like almost we're moving towards some kind of techno-feudalism. The middle class is being wiped out, suffering. The sovereignty of the nation state is being diluted. You write, quote, "If the state does not assert control over industry will increasingly assert its influence over the state. This dilemma is solved by using regulation to transform tech giants into national champions aligned with state interests, a tactic that resembles the fascist political economy," end quote. And it does seem we're moving toward, an authoritarian, fascist, dystopian technocracy ruled by an aristocratic elite. Indeed, you write that the U.S. is becoming an authoritarian corporate state, and you cite Edward Luttwak in saying that, quote, "fascism is the wave of the future," end quote. So, how do you see this trajectory that we are on towards fascism or authoritarianism? And how bad do you think things can get? And is there any hope, kind of like, of returning to liberty?
Well, ideally, yes, of course, we should find a way back to liberty. And obviously, Edward Luttwak in no way advocated that, fascism is a great idea. He just argued that the political economies are beginning to give that indication now that this is how they're shaping up. Now, there is a tendency towards, inclination towards more authoritarian systems. The first is because we see that the relationship between capital and labor appears to be decoupling. Now, this was something that was already recognized in the first industrial revolution, which then resulted in capitalist economic systems, because you had to manage the relationship between capital and labor. Now, what was discovered is with each technological innovation, you have increased productivity, and then where does that extra revenue go? Now, we see that this tends to shift more towards capital, thus concentrating power. Now, again, I pointed out this shouldn't be anything controversial. This is, again, why you have labor unions. So you see collective bargaining power versus capital. Now, but for a long time, I guess it looked like there might be. I mean, the glory time of capitalism seemed to be from the Second World War until the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. As at this time, you saw the need for increased, more technological advanced production equipment needed more skilled workers, so they needed a more monetary compensation. Sorry. So, anyways, you saw somewhat the money being distributed somewhat evenly with labor, but this began to stop in the 1980s and pretty much stagnated since. So you had more and more concentration of wealth, and obviously since the global financial crisis, the middle class has been decimated, especially in the United States. But again, I just like to point out that this is not like an ideological argument, and I say that because that was the argument of Karl Marx, which was he expected capitalism to implode because at one point, all the money would go into capital. Capital would be more and more dominant, and at some point, the laborers would stand up and seize control over the means of production. But again, this is also from the free market capitalist. So John Maynard Keynes, or before David Ricardo, they were both saying the same thing. They recognized that as machinery became more productive, the wealth would concentrate more and more. So there had to be some kind of ways to redistribute the wealth or break up the monopolies. But the problem these days in international markets is how can you break up any of these big monopolies? They have these discussions in the US, but if you break up Google, if you break up Facebook or Twitter, they're not going to have the same attraction anymore. Also, they're not going to be competitive against the foreign technological platforms. So how do you have a platform which is strong enough to compete in international markets, but not so strong that it will dominate the domestic political system? So it's a very, so I guess it's easy, to lean towards these national champions or powerful states, they're not companies, but tied closely to the states, is a very natural, attractive solution. But again, it's very much not it doesn't harmonize very well with the concept of liberty or democracy or freedom. So it is very problematic, and it's not quite clear how they will deal with this. So again, the discussion in the United States, should it break up these tech giants? Should they absorb them into the state, so becoming effectively utilities? Either way, the debate is always, should it be strong corporate power or more powerful state? At no point is there a good solution to break it down to people power. I'm more of a pessimist on this issue, I guess. Also, I added that there seems to be a tendency, while in the past you had some competitive advantage to more liberal countries with freer markets and also more open political systems. Now, I think in this industrial revolution, we see more of a tendency to an authoritarian advantage. That is, as you're in the race for artificial intelligence, for example, you need two things. You need a lot of data and strong computing power. Now, authoritarian countries like China, they can get all the data they want. They can just extract anything, put up cameras anywhere, any personal information, nothing's off the table. So they can experiment with things. They can do a new innovative payment system without caring too much or being too concerned about legislation, because if something goes wrong, they can always reverse it and just go back to the way things were. So they don't have to go through all these different stages. Like we saw with the COVID, they're able to respond much faster because don't have to worry too much about civil liberties. So I guess this also creates an inclination for liberal states as well, liberal democracies, to adopt more authoritarianism to take advantage of this, which is also what you've seen in the United States now. This idea, of all the countries in the world who had put most value in freedom of speech, it was the United States. But now, effectively, you have the government hand in hand with these tech giants, and the tech giants censor anyone they want, and the government can say, hey, it's private industry. They can have their own services, or a Facebook Supreme Court. They just can make up entirely new rules. So if you would only said 10 years ago to the average American that this would happen, you would have Twitter shutting down major newspapers, censoring people. Most people would have thought it's belonged to some dystopian novel, but we're becoming more and more used to it. And this is, again, part of what we talked about before, the government being able to take back more control over communication and technologies. So it's a concerning development.
Yeah, I'm pessimistic like you as well. I remember I did an interview with Greg Copley, who's the head of a strategic defense institute. He said that a few months ago that democracy is gone. According to him, that we're entering into an age of authoritarianism. What that exact form will look like is yet to be determined. I was reading yesterday, CNN was discussing how these Western liberal democracies who've taken all of these emergency powers because of the pandemic don't want to give them back. So, and that's usually in history the norm, right? Once powers are taken, we don't go back to the freedom. So that's frightening. And as you mentioned, some of the solutions as a result of the concentration of wealth and the capital, this universal basic income, how do we solve some of these other problems? So now they're talking about universal basic income. I think Biden just announced that he's going to start giving money to children in America and adults, sort of like a universal basic income. And the previous economist that I've interviewed, Finnish, Tuomas Malinen, was commenting, saying that they've tried this in Finland and it's not going to work. And as well, it creates this dependency on the state. So it's like, if you don't do what the government wants, they can just turn off your universal basic income, which makes me think of another part of your book where you discuss the Chinese social credit system. And I feel that this is spreading to other parts of the world now. You were talking about other countries that are working with China, like in Africa or South America, where China is exporting this technology to them. I just read, I had been living in Kazakhstan. I couldn't believe it. Yesterday, they reported the Almaty airport is installing effectively the social credit system. You cannot go into the Almaty airports in Kazakhstan without downloading this COVID QR code app. And, my belief is that that's just the first step. Later, when COVID passes, they will just keep the same system and just, add modules to it, link it to your bank account or reputation or social media. And so they're now installing these systems. So, what are your thoughts of this Chinese social credit system and whether you see it spreading to other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, the social credit system does seem very, very dystopian. Again, for those not familiar with it, it's the Chinese government. They give you points or withdraw points based on your behavior. So if you're associating with dubious characters, if you're not calling your parents enough, you cross the road when it's a red light, you curse, criticize the government, suddenly your credit scores goes down and your ability to travel or buy a train ticket suddenly goes away. So it's a very scary possibility when the government gains this much power. Now, that's why I'm also very skeptical about the idea that our liberties and our norms or values will somehow save us, because often we see that as power shifts, how values are expressed changed. I mean, we don't have this credit point system in Western countries, but we see we're beginning to put in place similar ideas, but they're always expressed in terms of good values. So, for example, you mentioned you've been deplatformed, or you suddenly can't use Patreon anymore, or you associate with some right-wing groups, now you can't use your Visa card anymore, or you get to express the wrong opinion. You think Trump is a great guy, suddenly now you lose your Facebook account and your ability to communicate with the rest of the world. So there is this, already we see these tendencies across Western societies, also in academia, as it is, more and more self-censorship. You're a bit, you know that not all speech is tolerated, but it's always, the values always follow. So it's supposed to be well-intentioned. First it began, hate speech, don't for neo-Nazis or something we can all agree on, some horrible person say Hitler is the best, okay, we should be deplatforming him. And then slowly the concept of hate and racism, everything becomes a bit more watered out. And suddenly now, you use the wrong gender pronouns on someone and you're off Twitter for a week. So it's just very, it's a scary trend. And so again, we don't have the credit system yet, but I guess the COVID thing has pushed us a little bit more in that direction. again, you can see how fast it's happening as well. The case in Britain, for example, it's only a few months ago they said, no, under no circumstances will there be any COVID passport, vaccination passport that will only allow you to travel if you take in a vaccination. And now it's it's fine. So it was normalized very, very quickly. So you have again, it's not conspiracy theories. It's very much in your face, and they're very, very open about it. So, but it always has the best justifications. But at the end of the day, what was the norms and ideas about the proper role of government and the relationship between the state and its people is changing quite rapidly. And as you also correctly pointed out, there's few historical cases when the public hands over an immense amount of power to the state, and then the pandemic is over, for example, in the States says, well, okay, we don't need this anymore. Here you go. We're not going to track your behavior anymore. Or, like these COVID passports, I think the people are worried about digital COVID passports staying there after the pandemic is gone. I think that's very reasonable. But again, the technologies are in place. They probably won't go away.
Yeah, I want to get back to the question of the great powers. In your book, you write, quote, China has emerged as the principal challenger to the U.S. due to its ability and intention to assert technological leadership, its control over the geoeconomic levers of power, and to drive and its drive to develop its military force. China was the largest power in the world for centuries. And as you mentioned, it ended in the 1850s with the Opium Wars. And, today there's all this talk about U.S.-China Thucydides trap, World War III breaking out in Taiwan, South China Sea, wherever you like. And you also cite, again, Edward Luttwak saying, quote, methods of commerce are displacing military methods with disposable capital in lieu of firepower, civilian innovation in lieu of military technical advancement, and market penetration in lieu of garrisons and bases. So it seems that the 21st, end quote, it seems that the 21st century warfare between the great powers will be amorphous, hybrid, asymmetrical, unconventional, informational, geoeconomic, as opposed to traditional geopolitical military conflict. You don't touch so much on that in the book, but it seems that in the near term, at least, there's a decrease in the chance of a World War III. What's your thought on, the great powers and whether or not they will come into, direct military conflagration? Although we did see what was happening recently with the US and Ukraine on the border with Russia. That could have escalated, but what are your thoughts in terms of another global conflict breaking out?
Yeah, well, my main problem here when I started the book was how do you measure the impact of technology on great power politics? Because it does play out in many ways. Like you're correct, military power is one of them. Also, you have the economic rivalry, and then you have the communication aspects. So it's also quite central in the information war. But it's also ability to keep stable societies as they undergo this transformation. So there's a lot of areas where it impacts this great power rivalry. Now, the main conflict, the way I see it playing out, would be obviously the United States versus China. Now, for a while, especially since the early 90s, you had this very clear international distribution of the power. That is, the United States had cemented its role as the technological leader, and all the trade agreements at the time were promoting this very extreme international division of labor. So the United States would do all the innovation, the high tech stuff, the top tier high economic activities, while China would do assembly. And I used the example that the United States should invent the iPhone, the Chinese can assemble it, and this is how the free market is supposed to work, because they're not really in direct competition. But this created problems for many ways, for many reasons. For one, the United States, the idea that it could only control the top tiers didn't really work, because when they were able to, the new trade agreements, which extended the intellectual property rights, they also outsourced a lot of their own production. So what they realized, societies consist of people; it's not just numbers. So the tech and financial industries, they prospered greatly, but through the rest of the country, it was more or less gutted. All the manufacturing jobs were sent overseas. So you had now you had a very split society. So this created a problem for the United States, but also so it has this domestic component to it. That if the United States doesn't have any stability within, it can't mobilize its resources towards achieving its objectives. Again, if the people of the country don't even consider the ideals of the country or the interests to be the same, it's very difficult. However, possibly more important would be what China has done, because what China has done now is exactly the same as what the Americans, the Germans, and Russians did in the 19th century. That is, how should China compete its infant industries? How could it compete with the United States? Again, U.S. products are high quality and low cost, so they're mature, and they, in a free market, they can outcompete all Chinese industries, which are low quality and high price. So again, what they did in the 19th century is very easy. They subsidize their own industries, use some tariffs, and also non-tariff barriers. So the Chinese have pushed a lot of money into developing its own technological platforms, rapidly climbing up these global value chains. And now they find themselves faced off with a very different China. Now China can develop its own iPhones. It can also assemble them. It doesn't really need the United States anymore. So you have this the decoupling. So it's a bit hard to see how the competition will go. First, it looks like they were competing for different positions on global value chains, but now you see this complete decoupling. That is, the United States doesn't want to rely on China anymore. China doesn't want to rely on the United States anymore. So the United States trying to hold on to its top tier while China's climbing up and taking everything. But you also have this new trend by the high-tech countries that the traditional competition they had or relationship with low-wage countries, it doesn't exist anymore, because, well, it does still exist, but there's more and more trend now towards with new technologies that allow you to reshore production through robotics. Suddenly you don't have this same international distribution of power. So how will countries exercise power over each other in the future as this industrial revolution continues to take off? So yes, again, I think the tensions between the United States and China will really heat up to a great extent. What's interesting to look at is some of the other players, such as Russia, for example, because it's. I argue they're pursuing a different strategy, that of technological preparedness. That is, they don't need to compete directly with the Chinese or the Americans. They just need to have all their own domestic technological platforms and introduce their own domestic versions into it. So they're already doing it. They're developing their own smartphones. They have, they decouple from the Android systems. What many people don't realize in Russia is, unlike the other European countries, Google is not the biggest one. Amazon is not the biggest one. They have all their own domestic platforms. Facebook's not the biggest one. WhatsApp's not the biggest one. They have Telegram, so they have all their own platforms. So they're trying to build on this in a partnership with China. It's. I think there will be a big shift because of to win over these middle powers, if you want. Because since the Cold War came to an end, I think the United States was focused to a great extent in developing a Europe without Russia. So integrating all of the European continent under U.S. leadership, but kind of excluding Russia from that Europe. And now what they've seen, especially since 2014, is by achieving that goal, by pushing Russia out of Europe, they're effectively being pushed now towards China. And this is creating some concern in Washington. So you're seeing more signs now coming out of Washington that perhaps having this confrontation against both the Russians and the Chinese is becoming a bit of a disaster, because now China and Russia are becoming allies in all but name. Also, technological partnership is very much at the core of this. So I think you will see more of this great power rivalry being about technologies. Again, this is the main goal now of, for example, Russia. They're trying to decouple from all the Americans' technologies, all their platforms, and instead link themselves up with China. even space exploration. You see, let's cut from the Americans and go with China instead. So you're seeing at all levels, from e-commerce, mobile phones, all the way to space exploration. So it's really, the competition for a technological platform and avoiding dependencies on other technologies is becoming a very central focus now of great power competition.
And I guess my last question would be, I know your research focus is Eurasia, and I'm always fascinated by the topic of global governance, which you talk about towards the end of your book. And you write that nations are fragmenting, I think, into regional constructs with interregionalism, the new hope for building a future system of global governance. China and Russia are seeking to integrate various regional formats and harmonize interests under the Greater Eurasia initiative, or sort of like a Eurasian union. It seems that the world will be divided into regional geoeconomic blocks, and so are we going to see this? We have the European Union now, we have the African Union, we have the South American Union, we have NAFTA, which is now NAFTA 2.0 with the USMCA. So did you envision like the future, this world of regional blocks that are unified, not just economically, but moving towards, like a political unification? Is that a trend going forward?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, since the Second World War, you kind of had the West established, which was the United States and the Europeans. Now, you had already the first regions, like Europe forming as a region within this partnership. But that was also the unipolar era that followed. So the Europeans were seeking to see collective bargaining power under the European Union, not to decouple from the Americans, but rather to have more synergy, more symmetry. In the relations, so they wouldn't, it's more equal partnership. But still, it was very much committed to the idea of the unipolar order. So the West collectively would more or less call the shots around the world. Now, what you see now is, a lot of the regionalism that the United States set up had this fit within the unipolar structure. That is, Europe aligned under the United States, East Asia, different partnerships, primarily through Japan, also aligned under U.S. leadership. Now, the main challenge was both Russia and China in this system believed they didn't have any proper political subjectivity. That is, they were essentially objects that had to follow what the United States said, but they didn't really have a voice in the system. So now you see them aspiring to challenging this dominance of this transatlantic partnership with what they now define as Greater Eurasia, which means integrating anything on the Great or Eurasian continent into one big club, if you want. So anything from Europe to Asia, all of it together. Now, obviously, this will be based also mostly on technological platforms, which is if you integrate the economies, then create economic dependencies, then usually political loyalties follow thereafter, which is why the United States is so worried about, in this Greater Eurasia format, the Chinese technologies being such as 5G Huawei being implemented in Europe, because as the Europeans grow more and more dependent on the Chinese, they're less likely to follow the American lead. So there is this. I guess the way we looked at globalization before, which was to some extent Americanization, the world integrated under free markets under U.S. leadership. Now you see, I guess, more breaking into regions, and I think globalization then would seek to find some way of cooperating between these regions, which is what you see now, for example, between China and Russia. Russia insists that China and Russia would cooperate together, but again, Russia wants to cooperate through the Eurasian Economic Union and China. So partnership between those two to have more equal relations, much like the European Union wanted this collective bargaining power to cooperate with Americans. And now they're also seeking to find a way of pulling the Europeans a bit closer as well. So I think it's somewhat a fragmentation of what globalization has been. So instead of being centralized, it's going to gravitate more into regions cooperating, and also it will be more and more multipolar in terms of not unipolar anymore. And it will have a great influence, especially here in Europe, because the U.S. priorities are shifting now that U.S. is looking more towards China as its main rival. What are the Europeans going to do? The U.S. will demand more and more geoeconomic loyalty from the Europeans. So don't trade with Iran, don't buy Russian gas, don't use Chinese technologies. Meanwhile, the Americans will be able to deliver less in terms of material gains or security for the Europeans. So at the same time, then, while the Americans may be able to give less and demand more of the Europeans are now shifting more towards prioritizing strategic autonomy, saying, no. I mean, from France, Germany, they're all saying the same thing. We can't follow in the American footsteps anymore. We have to be able to act as a sovereign entity, or sovereign Europe, as they call it now. So it's very, it's very much, I guess fragmentation would be the right words. So, and it's difficult to see how the Americans will react. I guess if I was advising Washington, I would say that the international distribution of power is already shifting. What it should do is negotiate a multipolar system where the United States can be effectively the first among equals, because what it's doing now is very problematic. It's trying to maintain the unipolar system, but in the process, by not facilitating multipolar system, it sees countries from Russia, China, and others coming together, developing a multipolar system in opposition to the United States, and that's very unfortunate for the U.S. And furthermore, in order to uphold this geoeconomic loyalties, it's also now coercing its allies more and more. So again, this told its allies not to join the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, don't use their technologies. As I mentioned, don't trade with the Russians, Iranians, and don't buy Russian weapons. And one after another, you see countries breaking this. So from India to Turkey, they're all essentially defying the United States because they want to act as sovereign entities. But in that process, the more the U.S. punishes its allies and its adversaries for failing to follow U.S. leadership, the more they recognize that they need to reduce their dependence on the U.S. So it's it's an unfortunate development, because I think it would be good for the world, for the United States to still have a very central position. But again, even the European Union now are defining its most important objective to have strategic autonomy, which is a nice word for saying less dependence on the United States. And again, this also was driving Chinese and Russian policy. So I think it would be, as we fragment into this multipolar world, it would be better if the United States would find some way of working towards first among equal formats.
Yeah, because otherwise it could create friction that could spiral, again, into big problems. What I liked about your book was that it was a very level-headed and sober analysis. Some books on this topic will veer to this end of the world dystopian world war scenario. Others are way too utopian and pie in the sky. But you gave a really kind of like level-headed analysis and said, well, it can go both ways. So I guess we'll just have to see how things pan out and work towards keeping our freedoms as much as we can. You are on Twitter. Are there any websites or other books or projects that we should know about?
Yes, I have another book coming out later this year, I guess in August, September. So the title is Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, which is somewhat what we discussed now, which is the efforts by China and Russia to pull Europe a little bit towards this Greater Eurasian partnership, in which technology is a central feature as well. So you see the Europeans a little bit stuck between the transatlantic partnership with the US and this Greater Eurasian region, which are trying to build with new strategic industries, new transportation corridors, new financial instruments, and pull in the Europeans. So that's that will be out in I think September, but Gonna have to double check that.
So in a sense, Europe has become the object of this new great game, like a kind of a reversal. And I think your previous book was on Russian conservatism that was also recently published. I definitely recommend people follow you, Dr. Diesen, on Twitter. And you have interesting commentary there, as well as your op-eds that you write, and your books as well, Great Power, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Great Power Politics. Thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.